we're really thrilled to have Pato Hebert with us tonight, and in fact over the next 4 days or so. He's here as part of a conversation among some faculty members at NYU in New York about thinking about, don't know what to call it, but kind of publicly engaged art practice, and what that looks like as a discipline and what that means, and might we have a residency here for an artist who's involved in a public practice. So it's a good conversation, but he will be available here in the next several days if there's something you want to talk to him about. He is a visual artist, educator, and cultural worker. His definition, I think. But a very interesting way to describe one's artistic practice. He splits his time between New York City and his studio in Los Angeles. Do you really still go back to Los Angeles?
Oh yeah, I'm counting the clock till mid-December.
You were born in Idaho and spent your child there and in Oregon. He lived in Panama, where his mother is from. He joined the Department of Art and Public Policy at NYU, which is a department in Tisch. Again, maybe of interest to some of you in the future. In 2012. Prior to NYU, he was a visiting assistant professor at Reed. Anybody from Reed? Well, NYU, that's good. We sometimes have Reed students here, and Scripps College. He also taught at the Art Center, College of Design, and the University of California, Irvine. I will let him represent his own work because I wouldn't want to mess that up. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being among us for the next few days, and we look forward to hearing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. We're good. Thank you to everyone here in Firenze and of course at La Pietra, especially Ellen, but also a whole bunch of folks who made it possible for me to be here. Anna, Angela, Lucia, Mario, the crew that's making sure we have this for posterity or some kind of media ether. And of course, all of you. It's not lost on me how busy you are and how complicated our times are. And I'm very grateful that you came out to share part of your, I guess it's now Wednesday evening, right, with this. Can I just get a sense, I like to do this so I have a sense of who I'm with and what kind of space we might make together. Do we have any artists in the room? And that can be a small A artist. It doesn't have to be a capital A artist. Okay, more hands now, right? How about any teachers? Not necessarily formal, but do you think of yourself as someone who imparts knowledge or shares knowledge with others? Yes, a couple of hands, right? Anybody who feels like you organize, you help put on productions, or you help people come together, you convene things. Anybody who feels like you work in wellness or health or helping people flourish and be their best selves. So now I feel super at home because I kept seeing lots of hands go up. My sense is that many of us wear lots of hats and have lots of interests, and I feel really strongly that we're irreducible. That can also be a little crazy making because we move in so many directions. I've already had a couple conversations with folks today about that. But I really believe in the possibility of weaving different elements in and out of each other. And sometimes they're distinct, and sometimes they come together in a way that's so seamless you can't necessarily tell where they've come from. It's like a really good Italian dish or something. And you know there's lots that went into it, and yet it seems somehow effortless. And that's a tall order, but I think that is a practice well made and a life well lived. So I'm going to purposely weave a bunch of different things that I've done with others and in the realm of art in particular, but also education. And I'm not going to be chronological. I'm going to move in and out across time, and hopefully that will give you some sense of the textures of what has interested and challenged me over time. I titled tonight's talk, Make No Loud Noise, and my sense from the reverb is that you can hear me. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to start with a picture that is, in terms of authorship, not exactly mine, but I would start there as a way to ask us, who makes and owns and inhabits and values an image? And I'm using here a photograph as the image, but it might be something even bigger, a gesture, a thing, an experience. Can you guess who this is? I used to have hair, look at that. So this is me with my mother, she of age 23 at this point, and this is probably a Sears Roebuck department store studio, or maybe Montgomery Ward's, in a very small town called Idaho Falls, Idaho. And when I was young and in a place like Idaho, my mother's from Panama, she would be with me in public spaces and people would ask her whose child I was. They thought that she was my nanny. So you can imagine what that must have been for her to be displaced from her own child in this space that for her was a new space, a new place that she was living. And I think quite a lot in my work about place and space and our relationship to place and space and one another. These are my folks. Not exactly sure what the location is, though it's probably somewhere in Panama City shortly after they met. And this is them many years later. This is 2002 on the lower left in front of the church where they met, which is here. And this sits just inside of a territory that the US government had carved out in Panama called the Canal Zone. And we don't have time, I have interest, but we don't have time to go into the full history of sort of Panama-US relations. But I come from this encounter. And this encounter, which was based at once in vision, but also in corruption and in, I think, deceit. And by that I just mean the way that Panama was built as a country. It used to be an outer province of Colombia. And for purposes of building the canal, a sovereign territory that belonged to the US was carved out on either side. So imagine the main river here, and carving out 5 or 10 miles on either side that was then the sovereign territory of another country. And just with that little snippet, you can begin to get a sense of the complications of the dynamics in play that brought my mom and dad's families together. This was a young priest, complete with cigarette, named Father Pat, after whom I am named. I never had the privilege of meeting him, but he apparently was a very forward-thinking young man, and he ran the Catholic youth group where my parents met, based in this church that I'm showing you in the lower left corner. And eventually left the church. I don't say that as a critique of the church, but what he envisioned as a way to be in the world with others, he felt like at that time was not possible in the worlds he inhabited. And so this person after whom I'm named and who was a very important inspirational person to my parents when they were only a few years older than most of you, sort of looms in my imagination. And in this case, a photo that I didn't see until much, much later. So part of what happens for me with photos, as with place, as with us, is how do we weave our stories in and out. This is my father's father. I carry his middle name, Joseph Edward Hebert is his name. And he went as part of a US government, I'll call it an expedition, using that language intentionally, to explore the possibility of making a new canal. So in the first part of the 20th century, the canal in Panama is a lock canal. So you enter a chamber, they close the door, fill it up with water, raises the boat. Open the other side, you leave, go to the next lock, raise you up. And in that way, they could traverse the Isthmus of Panama, which connects South and Central America, the Caribbean and the Pacific Oceans, and traverse a terrain. But that canal pretty quickly, as the boats started getting bigger in the middle of the 20th century, started being a little too narrow for business's interests, right? They wanted a bigger canal and a faster route. So my grandfather was there to explore the possibilities of using nuclear explosives to blow out the landscape and build a sea-level canal. And yes, it's okay to laugh there in the back. Kind of absurd and amazing, right? But try to imagine this moment in the mid-60s with the US full of its power in the world and believing that nuclear energy was the solution, right? Not only for powering cheap domestic energy, which was a desire of much of the world, but also for many other things. So this is one of the concept sketches. This was not by an artist, but I can't help but look at this as like some kind of a proposal for a biennial or something. It looks like these amazing, giant visions that artists sometimes have. And so that's why he was there, and in turn my father and all of his siblings. When they went to Panama, remember this is sovereign territory carved out of a sovereign nation, right? The line between Panama and what was called the Canal Zone, or this sovereign US territory, was where they were placed. My grandfather and my father's family. So here's my grandpa and grandma right on that line. So this is their front yard. And when my dad got there, he said it reminded him of Gaza or something. He had no other place to kind of put this demarcation of territory. This was my mother's school, and she had access to the canal zone. You can get a sense of this kind of U.S. colonial architecture that if you travel different parts of the world, the Philippines and some other places, you'll see this architecture that seems somehow inspired a bit by Firenze aspirations and a little bit of the Spanish colonial heritage that was, of course, brought and imposed upon the New World, quote unquote. So when my mother was, I believe, either a junior or a senior, and I should know the particulars, there was a massive dispute that broke out at her high school. And as the US and Panama were negotiating with each other about how this sovereign territory would eventually maybe return to Panama, one of the small pieces of the treaty was that both countries' flags could fly on flagpoles inside of what had been an only US sovereign canal zone. Is that making sense? So Panamanian students, as a way to say this is our space, went to that school site and raised the Panamanian flag, or attempted to. And some US students attempted to stop that effort, saying this is our space, right? And what resulted over many days was an incredibly violent encounter. And so this is the Panamanian side of that line I keep talking about, which in US nomenclature was called 4th of July Avenue, and in Panamanian nomenclature was later came to be called Avenida de los Mártires, which is Avenue of the Martyrs, right? And it made the cover of Life magazine. And we're accustomed to US intervention at that time, this is the 60s, thinking that, well, it's those Europeans that do that thing in other parts of the world, right? But this brought forward something quite obvious, which was that the US was also present and active in many parts of the world. And so this, Panama is a very small country, very rarely makes the headlines. This was a catastrophic event and huge. And the trauma of it, I believe, meant that my mother never spoke about it to me. It was only in the last couple of years that she spoke about this massive event that was a global spectacle that had happened where she goes to school every day, or began, I should say. So these kinds of juxtapositions and these histories and what can be read and seen, but also what may lie invisible in photographs or in images, as I said earlier, it compels me. This is my mom's folks and my tia Letty, my aunt Letty, on a visit to the US and the beautiful place known as Yellowstone National Park. My mom and my grandmother. My grandmother, third from left in the back row, with her scowl and her brow that I think I still carry, and all of her siblings. This is in Santiago de Veraguas, which is, I think, now the third largest city in Panama, and it's capital of one of the central provinces, so about halfway to Costa Rica from the canal. This is Frantz Fanon, A Dying Colonialism. There is not occupation of territory on the one hand, and independence of persons on the other. It is the country as a whole, its history, its daily pulsation, that are contested, disfigured, in the hope of a final destruction. Under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It's a combat breathing. From this point on, the real values of the occupied quickly tend to acquire a clandestine form of existence. In the presence of the occupier, the occupied learns to dissemble, to resort to trickery. And I can't help but hold this, having just come through Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, in relationship, though this was written some 5-6 decades ago, to the very kinds of conundrums that we're now collectively and globally. Old image from Debray, 1595, documentation, or at least interpretation, and I'll put them next to each other as two different possibilities, of the Spanish first incursions onto the Isthmus of Panama and indigenous resistance from above, right? Pouring molten liquid, etc. And then a statue many years later, on the edge of the sea, Columbus, the defeated native, in this kind of juxtaposition together up on a pedestal. And the caption says, "Statue of Columbus at the mouth of Canal." This is in Colón, which is on the Caribbean side. This was many years later, and I'm purposely sliding multiple histories right up into each other here. This is many years later, 1990, US invasion of Panama to oust Noriega, who was the leader, and I couldn't help but see these kind of across time, the way these images start winking at each other. And these layers of encounters that happen in space. So this leads me now to some images that are mine. And this is a body of work I made in 2000 called Hay una vieja que está enamorada, which in Spanish, the literal translation would be there's an old woman in love. But it's used as a colloquial term to describe this beautiful moment that happens in the tropics where it can be raining and the sun is shining, right? Because the clouds are moving in and the rain comes through quite quickly. And that may happen here in Firenze, I'm not sure, but these beautiful moments. And so this idea of someone who's so in love that she's weeping from the sky, she is the sky, right? And maybe the space is the love. And so I loved that colloquialism and started thinking about these layers of history. So this stone structure we see in the middle is one of the oldest Spanish buildings on the isthmus. So when the silver in particular, but also the gold, was brought up from Peru, from the Inca Empire, up the coast to the Pacific side of Panama, it entered here, as it were, and then crossed the isthmus, because there was no canal, came off to Europe and helped build the Spanish Empire. And so I'm really interested in looking at these, what we might call ruins, as these ways of thinking towards the future. And in the upper right side of the picture, you can see some of the more contemporary neighborhoods in Panama City, beautifully sited, right on the ocean, skyscraping towers. My grandma had not been to that part of the city in quite a long time, and when we took her in Spanish, she was saying, "Mira, mira los torres." She was saying the towers, look at them just reaching to the sky, right? She was in a different temporal space and could not imagine these buildings going to the weeping sky. And so into these spaces, again with these histories, prospective routes of new canals that my dad's dad was involved in. This was mural on the military barracks inside of the canal zone, law and order south of the border. Again, I don't even know how to begin to hold this in relationship to what's transpired over the last week. Into those spaces, I inserted my grandma's wicker rocker as a kind of absurd and playful gesture, right? She's obviously not the guard at the edge of the base on the bottom there. Is she playing hide and seek, or are we in this, 500-year-old ruin that's in the top image? And how am I looking at these much older ruins of a Spanish presence on the isthmus speak to what was the beginning of an erosion of the US formal military presence, which you see in the bottom image? Does that make sense? So how to look at these two kinds of buildings and juxtapose them. Azule has this really beautiful theory she's enunciated about the ethics of photography, which she calls in her book the civil contract. And she says the spectator's work, which would be perhaps all of us, also is one of prolonged observation, performed on the margins of a particular activity or event. The spectator observes a certain space and has the capacity to report on what she observes. From her position, the spectator, now she's juxtaposing this to whoever, quote, made the image, took the picture, right? The spectator can occasionally foresee or predict the future. Thus, she is able, through skilled observation, to identify and forewarn others of dangers that lie ahead. And again, you think of who are the spectators and who are the actors in the surveillance, violence, response, resilience, unity, disunity that we are now enacted in globally. Again, this is what's called Panama Viejo, or Old Panama, the old city. I'm interested in how it's buttressed up, and of course these structures have to be maintained, right? Otherwise they would completely crumble and be reclaimed. Back in the canal zone, a bus stop. Westgate, and trying to talk about, not trying, she does, but trying to theorize a sense of place. And Zillmans defines place as a site where memories play a vital role. So how is your sense of being here in Firenze shaped by your emerging memories? How is your sense of place from wherever you've come from shaped by a sense of memories, right? She says an undefined space will turn into place, a particular place, if one feels familiar at home or at ease there. If one goes back to the past to relive long ago events, that might also make a particular place. If someone special, or if some special object, is venerated or remembered, that might make a particular place. It seems particularly relevant to a place so steeped in history and particularity as Firenze, right? Layering upon layering upon layering. In fact, many artworks are applied play with and refer to this quality of place. What appears to be documentary evidence, however, of a specific site often works as a dislocation. So we might think of a photo as saying, that's it, that's who that was, that's what this particular place was. But a lot of folks now are saying it might not be quite so simple. And so the site itself might stimulate a flow of thought and memories, but at the same time it makes us painfully aware of the fact that it's not the actual site. Sight can thus refer to losses as well as gains. And I'm just going to leave that as a little bit of a challenge to me and to us as we think about what is place in sight. Again, trying to photograph these layers and using the rocker as a way to both be playful but also speak to these absences and presences that pulse for me in the space. This is brand new shopping mall being built now inside of the canal zone, which is now no longer the canal zone because in 2000 all of the territory was formally reverted at the end of a transition period that happened. And yet there are still these moments of kind of US presence, like a baseball field that is cut out of the edge of the jungle. So next to these landscapes, I juxtaposed portraits of my family members. Those were in color, the landscapes obviously black and white. And I'll just give you a close-up. When my grandfather, my mom's dad, was nearing the end, he made it out of this time in the hospital, but it was near the end. And my grandma had brought this cheesy but endearing heart-shaped box of chocolates, right? And then she spontaneously did this, not prompted at all, and made a crown out of it, which I found so silly and endearing at the same time, and then leaned over and gave him a kiss. And of course, I'm there as a photographer, and in some ways driving my mom and others crazy that I even have my camera out in this moment, right? As if it were an imposition. And it's not that long ago, 12, 13 years, but it's right before we all would have been doing this anyway, right? So the presence of a camera in a scene like this was actually not that common, particularly a scene that was about a transition out from life rather than a transition in, for example. And so this seemed staged in a way, but was not. And then I combined it in this technique that's called lenticular photography, and I call it, it's like you may see these pictures where somebody blinks and then opens their eye, and it's like an image that's got a plastic set of lenses on it. And it allows you to have more than one image inside of the object at a time. So as the viewer moves, a different image is revealed. Is that making sense? And what it did is layered all three of those images into each other. And as Hooper reminds us, you know, a photograph can both gather and disperse the event. So again, it may not just be a document. La Pietra may not only be a document of something in time. It's something that's unfolding and dislocating and presencing out new meanings as well. Both things might be happening at once here. And I would suggest that's part of what the dialogues are about in some ways, right? Is this movement in and out. And so Hooper would say, we're now unable to say with certainty where and when the photograph begins and ends. It's not just a thing on the wall or a thing on our hard drive or phone, right? Where does it begin and end, particularly now that we're fast forward circuiting it all through social media, etc. Hooper's theory arose before social media kind of would make it so obvious. But I think she was seeing into the future by studying what images had meant and might mean. So this just gives you a sense of these three images intact. So it looks like 6 separate images. They combine to be a single combined object on the wall that then layers those in and out. So who my parents were, who they were a decade ago, and then how they move in and out. I always like to joke that that looks most like me, right? The mashup. And now they have software that will do this, but and so this movement in and out. Same thing with the contexts themselves, moving in and out of each other. My brother, his wife, amazing Noriko, she's from Tokyo. 2 of my 3 nephews, we've now added a 3rd to the family. And this ongoing kind of space alive, ever changing, ever shifting. Go back there just so you can see it. This, I don't even know what to do with this. We may recall the massive earthquake in Japan, 2011, I believe, and the ensuing tsunami and the nuclear power plant meltdown, right? So these kind of complicated layers of causal histories. Well over a year later, across the Pacific Ocean on the coast of Oregon, near to where I was teaching at Reed College, as Ellen says, this lands on shore. A giant tsunami earthquake meltdown surfboard that was a Japanese dock, unmoored, and had moved all the way across the ocean. So it doesn't literally have anything to do with my family histories, and yet I can't help but think about these kinds of dislocations. And that's not to make this be about my particular little biological family story. It's rather to say, how are we all connected through these massive massive movements, literally of the tectonics of the earth, but as well our countries, our languages, and maybe even our possibilities. And so, you know, again, this feels like some kind of a giant contemporary artwork intervention, and it was anything but. And it was so huge, people struggled to figure out what to do with it. Do we leave it there? Do we disassemble it? All kinds of questions ensued about what happens when this comes ashore. Again, back to the schematic for the project my grandfather was working on. Azule again. What was quote there, it certainly existed. The dock existed, right, before it was unmoored. The land existed before it was cut in Panama. But not necessarily in any finally determined way, and no determination of its significance has exhausted the possibility of other such determinations. And she says, that's why we matter. That's why you matter right now. I'm giving this thing called an artist talk, ostensibly about work that I have made, but it's really you and then the we that would make the images I'm showing you we. Does that make sense? The spectator's role, crucial, she's saying. That's what makes things visible. A person's responsibility to the historical agreement over the status of the visible requires this reconstruction. And so she builds a whole theory about spectator, because we sometimes think of spectator as being passive, right? Outside of the thing, looking at it. What happens if it enfolds us and actually we become a kind of author or co-creator? So, interested in these ideas and what they would look like as I began to play with them in a place like Los Angeles, which also has all these layered histories and is built very different, much younger city in terms of its built architecture than a place like Firenze, which is why it's so exciting for me to come here. Los Angeles, every 2 or 3 decades, seems to need to erase its own history. That's not quite true, but it's a little like that. Is anybody here from LA or Southern California? Yeah, where? San Diego, yeah. I keep positing that we're going to have this space where from almost the border up to Santa Barbara, it's just going to be one giant LA suburb or something. I'm not hoping that happens, I'm just saying. And yet within what I just said, you get these spaces like this, layered with all kinds of histories, including cha-cha. And I guess somebody doing something with the wire and hanging things. And so I was interested in photographing LA in a way and photographing an LA that didn't necessarily look like what's exported through, you know, say Hollywood. This is actually a subway stop, and yes, LA does have a subway. The stop was new. And they commissioned someone to do this incredible succulents garden that's then right next to a tenement. And so you get these weird and beautiful and interesting juxtapositions in a place like Los Angeles that interest me. And again, you'll get the presencing of many places, many countries, multiple languages, pulsing in relationship to each other, because LA is such an international and really global city. Just walk you through, these are from 2000 and it's a series called Territories, but in the sort of middle left you can see Ghost World, which I didn't know at the time I made the picture, but a comic geek friend of mine taught me was a underground comic, which later became an animated film. So somebody's moving around the city tagging Ghost World. The homies are moving around claiming the space, black and blue against each other, with each other. You can't see it, but in the top middle there's a tiny dry erase board that's advertising headshots and casting calls. And then if we move further, we've got a system disposal, which is both literal and somehow metaphoric to me on the garbage can. And then a billboard that in Spanish says, because if you use this detergent, it'll be safe to air your dirty laundry, right? So there's all these textual plays. And so I'm working ostensibly as a photographer, but I'm not sure that I authored the image, right? Which is to say, how to be in conversation with all these different kinds of poets who may or may not have been writing in relationship to each other, right? But in a place like a city, get juxtaposed or layered. And then the city ever under construction, right? Ever reinventing itself, ever making itself. I started using this camera not as it was intended, as a landscape camera, but on a playground at an urban middle school where I was teaching in San Francisco. So this is 1996, and an early body of work, one of my first early bodies. And so I was working as a bilingual teacher's aide during the day, and then after school I ran a photo program. So these are various students at this school. And, you know, was interested in that's why I love coming to Firenze. This is only my second time, but I can't get enough of studying the compositions of the masters, right? And these massive images at scale, holding together multiple stories at once. And I was interested in photographic panoramic space for its possibility of hinting at what painted space has taught us for so long. And one of the ways I thought about this is if you were to attach a string, say right under the eye of each of these people, and pull it out into our space, the space of the spectator that makes, you would start to get a sense of all these vectors, right? And how space, even though the photograph flattens, it still can be quite active. And this camera meant that some folks on the right or the left might think they weren't necessarily imaged the way they were, that it was only Tanisha in front who's, say, being photographed. Whereas Crystal on the back and the left there, she's having herself a moment as she sits down totally bored in PE class. Or Irene's in the back wondering if class is over yet and she can move on and get changed and get off to math. And all these narratives could be happening at the same time. So these images were then blown up and installed as photomurals in the school. And the neighborhood where this school exists in San Francisco has a rich tradition of painted mural histories, inspired going way back to the frescoes, right? All the way back to, say, here, and coming forward through folks saying in their neighborhood, what if we wanted to make an art that could be accessible to people in public space? And I loved that tradition in the school and in the neighborhood, but was also interested in updating it a little bit by making it photographic. So then these went up in the school. And they were up for about 15 years, and finally the school decided to take them down just about 1.5 years ago, which I was okay with because they'd aged and they were never meant to be permanent. They were only meant to be in the space as long as the space felt like it was relevant. And obviously each year 200 new kids are coming through, and so the photos became kind of timepieces over time. At the exact same time, so by day I'm in that space with my students and we're making art and making images and trying to use images as a way to claim space. On Sunday nights I would go to a queer Latino dance club called Pan Dulce, which in Spanish is really the word for sweetbreads. And I'm similarly interested in spaces of play, spaces of coming together, spaces where the rules loosen a little bit, like the playground does in a school, and how these two bodies of work might be talking to each other, seemingly very different, but perhaps not so. The gender play that happens and the love, right? The love across these codes that are being used to kind of create new possibilities. I love the nail polish, the devil tattoo and then the light blue nail polish. With this tight shirt that I could never pull off that's got some kind of a panther saying hi to you, right? So, also interested in the movement. The space as a place for people to come together, again, pre-social media, and move together and be moved through the art form of music and dance. So, shortly thereafter, that's back in San Francisco. Again, I'm weaving here. I leave San Francisco to go to Southern California to go to graduate school. And shortly after graduate school, I had this tremendous opportunity to work with communities of color all over Los Angeles County to try to develop messages around HIV and to try to do something that might on the one hand look like a public health campaign, but pulse like a community art project, which was ambitious. And so one of the first images we did was, or designs we did, was to pull this image from up north, which still was quite legible in LA, and then put it all over the sky in Los Angeles. Or this image, juxtaposed with the tagline Contra SIDA con cariño. SIDA is of course AIDS, and this is against AIDS with affection. So this is 2000, shortly after the medicines had emerged that helped people stay alive. AIDS was no longer a death sentence, but on the one hand, people thought maybe I don't need to worry about it, therefore. On the other hand, some people were saying that's somebody else's thing, that's not going to impact us. And either way, the disease, as we just saw in the headlines with Charlie Sheen, is still quite stigmatized, right? Still, all these years later. So how to create a different narrative about HIV that might understand affection as one kind of response. Not the only one, not instead of medicine, not instead of thinking critically about choices, but as one thing that we might need to respond to something like HIV. So I'm thinking about these kinds of spaces, and I still do HIV prevention work, and I won't bore you with all the details, but I've been doing it since that time, since the mid-90s, and mostly at the beginning working with art as a way to bring people together to have a conversation that might be difficult otherwise. It's difficult to talk about stuff, and if you say to someone directly, tell me about your situation, that could be tricky. But if you say, what's the worst date that you ever had? Or what was the sweetest way that somebody approached you, right? Or who do you feel most supported by? And then after that, who do you feel most judged by? The space softens and loosens at the edge, and you can start to talk about other things. So the art wasn't just an instrument. We weren't trying to instrumentalize it to get somewhere else, but it was a space that allowed for other kinds of possibilities. And I still work in HIV, mostly now doing global advocacy and helping folks doing grassroots organizing have their messages taken up to the decision makers at a global level. And I'm happy in Q&A to talk about that more. But one of the things that the work takes me to do now is go to the international conferences, which happen every couple of years, and thousands of people converge from around the planet to try to say what's happening with the disease, both at the medical level, but also at the cultural level, and how might we hold these different approaches together. So as a conceptual artist, in addition to doing that advocacy work, I'm interested in the way people are moving down the concourse. And these are and aren't so different from the images on the dance floor to me, right? Like bodies moving in relationship to each other as a way to try to make space and meaning anew. I'm gonna skip over this in the interest of time, but again, bodies moving in relationship to one another in order to make space and one another anew. And I just showed this body of work for the first time 2 weeks ago. I'll give you an installation shot in a minute. And somebody, three people actually, when they walked in said, "Is that an airport?" And I actually loved the response because we're trying to deal with something as complicated and layered and for me as urgent as HIV. And the space in which it happens is a giant business conference center because it's the only space that has the capacity to host that many people, right? And so you get these spaces that look a little bit like malls, airports, conference centers. And you don't know if you're looking at the work who these folks are or what they're doing, right? It's a very different kind of message than the ones that were on the billboards. The labor that makes this work possible. And then what happens once they're installed, 120 of them that anchor a room that's probably about as wide as this room we're in here. So there's a detail shot and a little bit better sense it's compressed. Documentation's not great. This is just a cell phone documentation. We'll do the formal documentation when we disassemble the show in a couple of weeks. But to give you a sense now of the field that's made up of these individual movements, right? So in some ways this looks a little bit like single images that I showed you from the club or the playground, the billboards that I showed you, and that nonetheless I hope activate together a different kind of space, which is a gallery space. Another billboard campaign going back to 2003. This is in suburban Los Angeles, developed with community members. And the campaign was meant to, again, think about what it would be to approach HIV with vision together, HIV visionaries or visionarios. But it also revealed the homophobia pulsing in the community. And so this tagger, who I think has gorgeous Batman tags, I love the Batman tags, also did these really homophobic assaults on the images, kill homos. Similar to another project I'd done with young people in LA in 2000 to 2002 that was trying to address hate crimes by young people against other young people. And when we were doing this workshop, this was a gay-straight alliance at one of the high schools. And when I asked them, the workshop was in January, I said, "What do you feel like you learned last year?" Just an open prompt like that. And Cindy, with her libretto, was kind of like going like this, and she was thinking very pensively, and she said, I learned that I'm brave. That's what I learned last year. And so we took that with an image of some of the group members and made it collective. So today we learned we're brave, and then it became part of this larger campaign, No Haters Here, and put it up all over the city. So you may recall that cactus garden that I told you about next to the metro stop. That's the image on the lower left. And then this beautiful Orthodox church is right across the street from their high school. That's the image on the lower right. And they went out all over the city. And on one of them, there was, again, this homophobic tag. And so I was driving by. It happens to be in my neighborhood, this high school, my neighborhood in LA. And I saw the fag that had been carved like a scarlet A onto the forehead, right? I was like, okay, I have to go document this. So when I went and documented and then was looking at the images, I realized, I can't know for sure, that there's actually multiple layers of intervention here. I think that the epithet was written by one author, and then I think a second author or group tried to reclaim the image by crossing it out in a different mark. And I don't know how legible that is from your perspective, but there are two kinds of marks. And it was only over time that I came to see, oh, there is this, of course, claiming of space, right? This dance back and forth between which values or which belongings are going to prevail here. And so again, the image, the place, which is to say we, never being static, always open and up for claiming, I would say. I want to shift a little bit to talk about teaching, and then I'll show you some non-photo stuff, and then we'll open up for conversation. Does that sound good? Parker Palmer is a teacher an educator and a theorist who I really admire, and Mary Rose O'Reilly as well. And she quotes Palmer as saying that when we teach, what we do is create a space. That's what we do when we teach. And so another project I did with UCLA and several amazing people, Michelle Arai, Angela Riley, Kimberly Robertson, and Rebecca Rosser, was work with young Indigenous youth in LA to try to understand how violence impacts the community. And so again, you can see this theme running through, like how do communities contend with the forces that challenge our well-being. And so we did a series of workshops about histories of violence and colonialism, but also strategies and the ways that they make meaning in their lives. And yes, you can see how old the project is by the phone itself. So here they are at the workshop. And one of the exercises, for instance, was to map safe ways home and dangerous ways home. So when you're navigating a contested urban space, particularly as a young person, how do you know where the police might be a little more ornery or not? How do you know where those guys on the corner might give you more trouble or less? How do you know where there's the store owner who will greet you with a smile and a welcome rather than treat you like you're going to steal something, right? How do you navigate space, and how do you make it with other people? And then how might they want to do that photographically? So we worked out of a community center, which is where we met. And this is December, which is why Ellen, I'm very excited to get back to LA in December, because this was a December workshop. And I was very moved. These young people at the end of a very long fall school year came together to do these series of photographic workshops, and then presented their work to the Elder Council, and also made a cake out of it. And then we showed some of the work at the Autry Museum, which is a museum that grew out of the collection and the support of Gene Autry, who was a famous actor in Hollywood Westerns, right? And the irony, is that it's also been this space that's been really important to creating dialogues about the western part of the United States as a terrain, and indigenous histories and present issues therein. So the statue there is not lost on me. So you can see, again, different ways. One of the things I love about photos is the different ways they can move in the world, from a dance floor to a billboard, or from a simple, okay, can we take the picture and move on, right? Clearly not happy, to a congratulatory cake. And the project was called Insight. And they clowned me and made sure that they left the part for me of the cake. So yeah, there's always a sense of humor and playfulness with this particular group, which was marvelous. Palmer says, tips, tricks, and we'll see if this is true at La Pietra for your education. Tips, tricks, and techniques are not the heart of education. Fire is. I mean finding light in the darkness or staying warm in a cold world, avoiding being burned if you can, and knowing what brings healing if you cannot. Feels like I could put that on the headlines from the past week, right? Yeah. That is the knowledge that our students really want. That is the knowledge that we owe them. What would be a fire of healing or convergence or synergy for us to have together collectively, right? What would that fire be as opposed to the fire of the bomb from street level, the bomb from sky? Not merely the facts, not merely the theories, but a deep knowing of what it means to kindle the gift of life in ourselves, in others, and in the world. And here again, this is Parker Palmer. So I've done I love working with young people, both as a teacher at NYU, but also at all kinds of levels, and I have for as long as I've been able. I feel very nourished by working with young people. And I got to be an artist in residence at one of my local elementary schools in LA, sponsored by a big museum in Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So I asked the students, most of them Latino, working class, some immigrants, some second or third generation, to talk about their school, which was called Placencia. And the fifth graders helped the kindergartners, and any of you who are parents or have younger siblings or who babysit or nanny know that just learning to hold that thing and make a mark, and the relationship of that mark to language and language to meaning is itself this amazing act, right? And so we then took that handwriting, these responses, scanned them, and made this limited edition of 700 t-shirts. And then they were distributed out back to the school community. And so Placencia sounds like, one of the prompts was Placencia tastes like. And one of the boys said, Mr. Pato, my school doesn't taste like anything. You know, and he was like, what are you thinking? I'm chewing on my desk, right? And I said, well, do do you think of any flavors there? And so it's like, oh yeah, Miss Johnson has blueberry muffins on Tuesdays, right? And so things like that emerged, but also these really rich conceptual ideas come out of these young minds that are nonetheless so alive and active. And so one of them said, Placencia sounds like a woolly mammoth jumping in the pool, right? And so I don't know if that came after a field trip to the Natural History Museum or what, but incredible imaginations, right, turned loose when we make the space of art. And when I met with the teachers and some of the students and staff at the start of my residency to say, this is not a me, it's a we, what do you want from this exchange? They were really concerned about the pressure to teach to the standardized test, and they felt like their curriculum and their school space was losing a sense of discovery and play and coloring, what they said, coloring outside of the lines. Does that make sense? And so part of the primary focus, I should say, of the residency that they asked of themselves and of me and the museum, all of us together, was to make experiences where we weren't just coloring inside of the lines. And so one of them was for students to make pictures. You know, move fairly quickly, but Carla's selfie and this beautiful picture of bubbles. These are all 1st through 5th graders. Look at this boy's sensitivity, right? Image on the right, if that's all I showed you, might start to conjure one understanding of this part of Los Angeles. Image on the left, very different, both coming through a single voice, but really that collective space that he's from. Jimmy lost his dad during the project. No connection, it just happened. And part of his portfolio was this image he made, and I profess my ignorance, I don't know if it was an Xbox or what kind of video game, but he took that technology, which he was very fluid in, to make this love letter to his dad. And sure, you know, in an art museum this could feel overly sentimental or something, but in a context where he's fighting just to be present each day with his peers and in school, the ability and the foresight for him to make an image like this and share it, I think, is quite powerful. He also made these 2 images, among dozens of others. Kelly, also incredible. In a small group of photo artists, 2 of them lost their parents. She lost her mother. She quite loved her selfies, and it's really interesting to see the images talking to each other across time here, right? And these 2 very sensitive, evocative images, I think. So then they were shown, you know, not a fancy, it's a public urban middle school, shown on these monitors that we borrowed from a local art school where I was teaching, and these images cycled through. And so they activated, well, here they are getting their flowers at the annual spring festival. Again, a little shy and embarrassed, but I think also very proud. Brought their families through, looking at the screens. And then there was another one in this all-purpose hall. Morton, I feel is getting a little tired, so I won't read it, but he has this idea of praxis, and it's theory, how we think about things and understand them, and then how we enact them. And that the danger is if we get too far in either side and think that one is opposite the other, that they really go together. And he says that praxis is that reflection can be a form of action, and that action, such as nonviolent protest, for instance, can be theoretical or reflexive, that these things go hand in hand. And that shapes so much of the work I do, whether it's with youth groups making HIV prevention campaigns, some of which I've already shown you, designing with their images and their ideas, moving out all over the city of Los Angeles, inspired by their own photographs and drawings, to this notion of cameras now moving on cell phones and the possibility of meaning, like those strings coming out of the photos I talked about earlier, moving in all kinds of directions. It's no longer only top-down. And she says that that an image, that as soon as photography became a tool available to everyone, that our way of relating to each other could no longer be mediated by a sovereign power, right, from above, that it had to be shared in more than one direction. These guys are cousins. Look at the fun they get to have together. Both young gay men, both from South LA, absolutely alive and claiming of the world with their lip gloss and sunglasses and camp posing and all the resistance and violence that they also encounter day to day just trying to move through the world. There's a huge body of images that the youth group made over time, thousands and thousands of images, including immigration rallies in downtown Los Angeles, and what it meant to presence a rainbow flag and a queer contingent at this rally. And then, nothing fancy, but every week or two, sometimes every month, they'd cycle in new images, just printed on a color printer, nothing fancy, construction paper titles, as a way to transform this kind of dusty office space into a space that felt more like theirs. They also would do notebooks, and all the while, I think, embodying the writer David Murrow's idea that imagination is intervention, that it's an act of defiance, just to keep our imaginations active and alive. Our imaginations alter belief. So one of the things we did to enact that was to run a community-based publishing house inside of a nonprofit. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into great detail, but we were quite interested in what would it mean to use comics and photo and poetry and short stories to tell the story of HIV, not just from a public health standpoint, but from the perspective of community members who were impacted. And so for most of the previous decade, after I did the billboards that I showed you, we started working in print form, because with these we could circulate out to 5,000 or 10,000 copies and distribute them all over the country. This was right before social media, and the funding for the work really dried up when the recession came in about 08, 09. And so right as social media exploded and new ways of telling stories from anywhere at any time, this project of telling it through the page ended. And I'm always wondering what would have happened if we hadn't lost our funding and if we had shifted to a multimedia approach to storytelling, which now we see all over, which I think is great. And the last issue of the art journal we did was called Corpus, and there were 7 issues, was international. And so it featured Reem Al-Qadi's work repurposing these Orientalist images into these kind of imagined queer narratives, reading them back onto these historical images, or these kind of campy send-ups that are also quite beautiful by Young Han San. Some of the earliest images out of Mexico of people living with HIV, early 90s. These were completely transformative when they were shared in Mexico City in the 90s. A collective that tries to respond to homophobia in Peru and does these beautiful actions in the Central Plaza there. Translates as homophobia kills, which any of you here probably could have figured that out. And so these remembrances, right? Public memorials, public claiming of space. And what's beautiful to me is, on the one hand, we have this fluid and magical gender expression on the left, and then a space where elders can also be part of it on the right. And so what happens when art opens up a space to inhabit space and our relationship to one another differently? A refrain that I'm weaving through today. Yusuf Nabil's beautiful black and white pictures that he then hand colors, growing up in Cairo and then also now living in between Paris and New York and elsewhere, he was interested in that history of hand coloring photographs. Sunil Gupta, really world famous artist who moves between London and India, and portraits of contemporary queer community members and activists both. And then Xavier Liverman's pictures from Pride in South Africa. I think Cape Town, and I'm sorry I don't remember exactly. Kester says, what does it mean for the artist? Remember, we've been talking about the spectator, what it means for you all to be making meaning as you so generously and patiently sit, right? And we're seeding a conversation together. What does it mean for me as the artist, quote unquote, or any of you as artists, to surrender the security of self-expression for the risk of an intersubjective engagement? That it's not just the genius artist that hands down the expression, but that it's something we might make together. This is a piece called Having Come Down Off It. And in the US, at least, there's a kind of tradition and a saying of the soapbox, because people on street corners used to get up on boxes that soap had been delivered in and do public oratory, right? Sometimes for political campaigns, sometimes to sell things. And it's come to take on a slightly negative connotation now when somebody's droning on and on like, hi, I'm gonna get off your soapbox, right? Because it's often when someone's talking at you rather than connecting with you or communing. So the piece is called Having Come Down Off It, and it's a big soapbox made up of individual soap bars. And the prompt and the invitation, it's a public performance, was to invite anybody who wanted to come up and in very kind of brief sharing, 2-3 minutes, share a time when they realized it was not all about them. And so the point is to try to invert the obsession with self while still, of course, telling a story of self, but self-connected to others. This is a piece also done as part of my residency there at this school in Maine called Stand Reflected. And so community members, it's a very kind of minimal conceptual piece, but just recorded the heights of people in their lives. And we're trying to figure out what some of these low ones were, whether they were toddlers or dogs or what. And then at those heights, we just randomized these reflectors that are quite common in rural areas when it's dark and you're turning a corner and you don't know where the edge of the road is. And it was at the edge of a parking lot. So by day, it's almost invisible as a piece. But in the cold winter nights, or even late fall like we have now, you exit the parking lot and the headlights just go, and the piece just comes alive through the headlights and then disappears again. Very simple intervention. Both of these using everyday materials, but trying to redeploy them in a kind of poetics with others. Same thing with these lawn signs that are very common for local elections in the United States. This is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Took this and then put out language and ideas from community members that I worked with. And the piece is called Text Messaging, and it anchored the front of a giant museum lawn in Southern California for the 2008 California Biennial. So somebody said, ingenuity is a form of survival. Another said, I feel vulnerable when I'm lied to. Another said, we're most honest when it benefits ourselves. And somebody said, possibilities exist over the fence, which I think was an allusion to the border, the US-Mexico border. Again, it's drawing from this everyday aesthetic, but trying to redeploy them differently. And it was an absurdist thing, kind of like the rocker, flooding the front lawn with all of these signs. Possibilities exist when you're given a chance. We're most honest when it's too late. I'm anxious at this very moment. And this was right at the cusp of social media, so they began to appear. And somebody blogged about liberating a sign, because there was, of course, no guard necessarily at night. And then wrote that the very next day after they had liberated it and put it out in their neighborhood, somebody else took it and kept it moving. So I loved this story, right? So I write her, I email the blogger, I don't know them, and say, I'm the artist, I really love this story about you taking the piece and one of the signs and the sign moving. I never got a response, but I was hoping to kind of close the loop. I think they felt self-conscious for having publicly admitted that they had, quote, stolen the sign. But in putting this work out there, it's a little different than the publications, it's a little different than the billboard. I didn't want them all to get stolen, but I also knew there was no control, right? And there were literally hundreds and hundreds, and so the way people engaged here photographically, but also as they began disappearing over time, I think was kind of interesting. Not being wishy-washy is difficult for me. Faith has taught me integrity. I feel vulnerable when I'm angry. The empathy we have for others is shallow. We're most honest when we're talking to God. I want to play out in the ocean. So just to give you a sense of all these different kinds of layers. Text piece inside of a gallery situation. The first word search I've done. How many of you do these word searches? You know these? They're quite common in English. Some people hate them. They drive them crazy. I really like them because I like the game of trying to find things. And as a designer who works with text and language in my practice, I just like letter forms. This is synonyms for search, and it's the first one I did. So there are 29 synonyms for search, and they vary. So in the lower left, starting with the P, if you go up, you can see probe. In the lower right, you can see pray as but two of the synonyms that we might understand for this idea of searching. How is a probe a way of searching, or is a prayer a way of searching? This is 51 synonyms for oscillate. And I'm quite interested in this idea of something vibrating on meaning. Detail, and they're made out of mirrored acrylic, so that as you move as a viewer in front of them, the space starts to move with you, reflected back into the piece. Sometimes I'll do text works on this space where architecture meets its environment. This one's a Diarus from 2010. This one is from 2013, and it's called When I Inhale You, When You Exhale Me. And so along these doors on the lower right, when I inhale you in these florid scripts, as you're inside of this gallery and you exit, the piece says, when you exhale me, almost as if the building itself was a body that we inhabit together. I'll take time for this. This is Hooper, and she says, neurosciences, so going to the sciences to better understand art, have proven the existence of hormonal and neural transmissions of effect, which is to say, we know now with certainty that our bodies and other bodies do not begin and end at skin. Do not begin and end at skin. And so I made a body of work playing with this idea of shared breath. These are simple photographs of my breath exhaled into cold night air. and they make these beautiful forms. These are, I'm not adjusting really for color or anything here. This is just, depending on the proximity to the camera, it'll produce these beautiful effects. And thinking, what would be one of the simplest artworks I could make? As minimal as possible, and yet perhaps speaking to some of the fullness of what I've been sharing with you tonight. And some of them verge on disappearance altogether. It's almost an image that isn't even there. Do we have another 5 minutes in us? We good? Yeah? This is last of a couple pieces I'll show you. And this was done with Chief Shelley DePaul, who's the first female chief of the Lenape Nation, native peoples in Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey. And this piece is called Fourth Crow, and I was invited to do a project at a small liberal arts school called Haverford and be in residence there. And the librarian generously offered me the library. And the library is this gorgeous old space, and they have a gallery in the middle of it. And in doing my research of the area, I found out that Shelley teaches Lenape language classes at a nearby school as a way to keep the language alive. And in beginning to learn more about the history of her people and the work that she does, she shared this story of the Fourth Crow. And it's a story that's been told for centuries, but when many descendants came together and started sharing stories that their moms or their uncles had shared, this story emerged. And in it, Crow at the start is a kind of, exists in a kind of what we might think of in the Western sense as Eden. Everything was in harmony and balance. In colonial contact, there was all this loss and suffering through disease. That's the second crow. The third crow is a time of hiding. And so as the story goes, third the crow, he saw him, his brother, he is dead, and he hid. As people were dying and as people were losing their land, how do you survive? And then in fourth crow, which is the time they believe we are in now, it's a time of resurgence and a time of resilience. So we put this story bilingually in English and in Lenape around the space, so that as you move through the space, you experience the story. And then we put these other forms of language. So you see this row of designs that runs across. It was quite common with many of the German immigrants to decorate the interiors with these beautiful stencils. So Lenape women adapted that form of expression and of making space. But into the stencil culture, they embedded their own imagery. So that if you were in the know, you would enter the space and immediately know you were in a Lenape home. And so although it was a form of hiding, it was also a way of making legible to each other their presence. Similarly, the men with one of the more important deities would carve the deity into wooden fence posts. Fence posts weren't necessary before private property, right? Before space was delineated and controlled in a certain way. So although they had to learn to navigate that new understanding of land and place, they could also orient to the west the deity that would help them still maintain their understanding of place. It was just a close-up. And then one of the origin tales, which speaks of a time when turtle arose and there was a cedar tree growing. And we might interpret that as a metaphor for just a land on which you could locate yourself in a space of water. But then combining these traditional motifs in a kind of contemporary sculpture. I think I want to close there to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. But thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here.
Did you use the quotes to, one, help us understand kind of the multiple installations in the projects, or are they a part of the projects? And if they are a part of your, installations, do you start with the quote and then kind of go off and try to find something to go with the quote, or do you start with the work and then get a quote?
It's a great question. So like what in this presentation is white text on black field, that's what you're referring to? Yeah. They are not usually part of a gallery or public-based presentation. So for when the kids are putting up their images, I'm not having an Azule quote about the spectator, right? And your question is a beautiful one, and it's an important one, and I purposely slide them in and out of each other in a presentation like this to reveal to you some of the theoretical thinking that in turn shapes my production. Some of those quotes I find after the fact, and they help me understand, maybe that's what we were actually working on. I didn't have language for it, right? Some of them become seeds and say, what would it mean, especially over time, to keep pushing this idea? What might it start to look like? But no, they're not usually included in the audience's experience of the work, whether in public or gallery spaces. The exception to that is that with artist statements that are sometimes printed and then left available, say in a gallery context, more so gallery than museum, they'll occasionally appear there. And when I do proposals for funding or a proposal for a project, they will often appear.
Right.
Yeah. I love your question. What was underneath it? What drove the question for you?
Just pure curiosity.
Curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? That was a great question.
Hi, I'm wondering about your advocacy work and that in conversation with art. So my question is, have you found it more effective when the advocacy work is like, I don't know, when, like you mentioned using art as a tool versus not using it as a tool. So in advocacy work, is it more effective when it is used as a tool or when it's just localized and like for the students? Or is that different?
It's a great question, and I don't know that anybody has the answer. I mean, I think there are risks in both directions. So I'll say a kind of, not a pessimistic, but I'll problematize it and then try to sew it back up. The risk of it being a tool is that it's what many people have theorized. It just becomes instrumentalized. It's an illustration. It's propaganda. It isn't full of whatever else we might think art can be. On the other hand, it can destabilize what is otherwise an expected process. Like, oh, I'm coming here to get my HIV test, right? Or I'm here to do a boring meeting. But I'll tell you, when I'm at meetings, I was talking to somebody earlier about how do you shape a team if you're in an organization, whether it's a business or a place like La Pietra. And it's like, okay, here's our agenda, da-da-da-da-da. There's an efficiency to that, but people often then start to play their role. But if you start a meeting like that by saying something like, I'm going to move quickly here, this, with a question like this, if you were something beyond a human, what would you be? The temperature completely changes from a board meeting, right? Or the start of class, or whatever the assembly is. And so we could argue that's art just being a tool, but we could also argue that it's art as a space. It's a space for another way of being together and maybe understanding ourselves and each other differently. And so there are times when I would say it's a tool in a toolbox, meaning it's one of many strategies. But I would hope that it's never drained of its magic or its poetics. Does that make sense? And I don't think art institutions are free of that danger. Art institutions too can kill art, can drain it of its possibilities, right? So one of the things you're seeing here is what happens when art is deployed in a context that's not about art, or when public health strategies are deployed in an education context, right? Or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What happens when you move these spaces into and out of each other? And sometimes it doesn't work. It feels clumsy and awkward and ham-fisted. But other times there's somehow this other way to approach things that's refreshing. It doesn't simply answer your question. And for me, and maybe we can talk offline together one-on-one, but the more concrete response is case by case, right? So in some situations, I can't call it art. I have to say I'm developing a health messaging campaign with young people, right? Even though they might be making pictures of their lives, right? In other cases, often in art world, I have to say I'm making art, but I might loosen the notion that I'm the only author of that. And there are many people doing that, so that's not a particularly new idea anymore. But, and so, you know, how it's coded may be slightly different than the fullness of what it does. And somehow that gets from me back to your question.
You had that piece of the photos of LA, and you talked about how you wanted to show a part of LA that wasn't what was being exported, and I thought that was interesting because we think of places as grounded in the space they occupy, and it seems almost paradoxical for something that's like rooted one place to be exported, and I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on that.
Well, I might start with the selfie. How many of you have selfies on your feeds right now? So, and I'm not putting a value judgment on that either way, but we tend to foreground certain parts of ourselves and not others, right? And so the questions for me, it's really interesting to look at somebody's feed and say, what is the sense of themselves that they're shaping through their feed? Some people there's lots of food, some people there's lots of fashion, some people there's lots of people, some people there's lots of here's where I've been, and all kinds of combinations, right? That LA that I showed you is not particularly glamorous. It's not been powdered and prepped for the camera, right? And yet it is, I think, much more typical than the one that somebody who's never been to LA might imagine LA to be. There were still some palm trees in there. There was still some blue sky, right? And I made a weather joke. And so the LA-ness that we've been taught to understand LA as is present, but there's all these other things, right? A multilingual LA or a messy LA, or an LA that can't be contained. And I think that's what I meant by presencing. And I don't know that I could have made that work, that body of work. I mean, I didn't elaborate on it because I showed you guys so much different stuff, but I was making as a way to try to understand LA, and I was making it at the same time that the billboards were being made. So my job was to go around the entire county, this massive area, talking with different community members about how do you understand your world. And in doing that, I would see these spaces that felt strange and beautiful and odd to me, because there'd be these layers of things happening. So it was also a way for me to get to know the space, and I don't think that I would have seen or known to see that LA without some time there. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
I feel like maybe it didn't quite get it.
No, I'm just
Thinking, yeah, okay. So, and that's true, like if I were to ask you to photograph your Firenze, it'd probably look a little different than mine, right? And we might have to put them together to try to get at Firenze, which would in turn, and I don't want to generalize because we have many people in the room, but be pretty different than somebody who's been here 7 generations, or so long the notion of being here is in some ways a silly question, right? And we might all photograph the dome, for instance, right? Or the river, or whatever we deem as Firenze-ness. But we might do it in very different ways based on how we understand it. And so the Firenze that gets exported to recruit you here or to recruit the tourists, nothing wrong with that. It's a magical Firenze. But there may be other Firenzes pulsing here, right? I'm always really interested in who are the immigrants here, for instance. Or how does Tuscany understand itself compared to the other regions? In a space that really wasn't a nation very long ago. It was a collection of city-states, right? And so how does that change our understanding of place and space? And so until somebody taught me that on my first trip here, I didn't know to read Florence that way. I was reading it through these other really inadequate lenses. And that's okay, I mean, that's what I came with. But that local knowledge really reshaped how I looked at it. And somebody said, pay attention to these faces, and then go look at all that Renaissance art that you love, Pato. You will see those faces. Those were real people serving as models and inspiration. And you can still see the curl or the arc of the nose or the jawline presencing in the bodies all around.
So can you, one, like kind of define what the word process means to you in the sense of you making your work? Yeah, and then basically how do you go about it?
We're going to be together for about a decade, right? They're great questions. Process. What is it? How do we go about it? Beautiful question. I think a lot about, and this gets to the notion of the prompt that I use a lot when I'm teaching, but also sometimes I'm making work with others. I think a lot about the relationship between structure and open-endedness. We have a structure. It's announced that there'll be a talk by an artist at 6 p.m. It's part of a larger structure, the Dialogues, right? And so we align with that. You come, I come, we engage this thing that we think we know what it's, some kind of sense of what it's going to be. Now I would suggest in the Q&A we're also in a structure, but it's more open-ended. I don't know what you're going to ask me, and now I have to respond on the fly, as opposed to whatever I've prepared and rehearsed and think I know. I'm really interested in that interplay between structure and open-endedness. Like how little structure can you have and still have it somehow work? How much open-endedness can you have and not have it just evolve into complete chaos? And my process moves along that continuum. So I might use the structure of a word search. That's a kind of form, right? But then think, this form's already pretty static. It's a grid, it's a puzzle, not everybody likes it. How do I do something interesting? And the process then might be, well, what might the content be? What might the materials be? Do those reinforce the form or do they somehow make it new? And then that kind of interplay. And I could do that for any number of these works. Sometimes in process it starts for me with just a sense of inspiration or an idea. And that idea might be just about materials. I want to play with burnt wood. Or I want to play with this shiny iridescent vinyl, which is a little hard to see, but the bottom row you can see looks pretty silver. And then when you turn in the light, it looks like an oil slick on the ground. It's this gorgeous kind of iridescence. So I've been trying to figure out what would I do with this material? I just like it, right? sometimes process for me is very solo. Like I don't want to do work by committee. I'm just trying to sit with something or work it out by myself. Other times, much of the time, it's made with others, and I love that as a teacher, as an organizer. Right now, you and I are trying to make some meaning together about what process might be. And I need both. Not everybody does. I totally respect and value my friends who are really about their studio time, deep solitude. Their research puts them in conversation with the world, but the making's really about solitude. I need that sometimes, and sometimes I need to connect with others. And if I'm too, for me, on either side of that in my process, I get a little worn down. Too much work by committee or engaging others drains me. Too much solitude isolates me and ossifies me, makes me stuck in my ways. So sometimes my process is to go out and look at things, or to ask questions like you just did, or to research. Other times it's to sit with what I've been absorbing and then try to understand what might it be. And again, I'm happy with any of the projects to ground that a little more, if that sounds too ethereal, but yeah.
I was really interested in what you said about unmediated public relationship via social media, and as well as what you just said about storytelling through your personal feeds on the internet. And I was wondering how you see activism or social outreach succeeding through these mediums, or possibly even being like drowned out in the white noise of the internet.
That's a great question, and that's why I need you and we need you all. Not that it's not quite as simple as you're the answer, though you are, or that any of us older than you are not the answer, which can also be true. But together we have to grapple with the beauty and I would say the intensity of your question. And I think that I'm struggling all the time with the balance of what I might call channel, something that somehow aligns a possibility or a meaning with the noise, right? And don't always know, but certainly with the Arab Springs, there was this incredible possibility of social media mobilizing, and Black Lives Matters as well, like ground level organizing. And in both cases, we don't necessarily have the world that those movements aspired to, probably because the ambitions were necessarily really big and magical, and therefore difficult to achieve and achieve quickly. Does that make sense? So I don't think that like hashtag activism is ever going to be enough. But I also don't think we can be without ways of talking to each other across time and space. So, and I'm not trying to reduce it to a platitude, but we will always need ways to communicate, and sometimes in code, and sometimes very directly, and sometimes with each other, and sometimes with whatever we deem as somehow other than us, right? In a literal way, how do you talk across language? You know, if you don't speak the same language. And when does that mean I need to learn somebody else's language, the language of Firenze? Yeah, literally Italian, but something even deeper, or in addition to, I should say. And when do we need to make a new language together? And so I think that the best that I find of social media is that we're not dependent on the traditional sources of information. We don't have to rely on CNN or artists in museums or teachers in schools, even though I engage all those, right? Like we don't have to, because people can talk to each other as they always have, but with a bigger platform and a potential to share ideas. But just having 1,700 followers will not a new world make, right? It is a kind of new world, but it will always then, like the Praxis quote, have to come back to saying, and what would those 1,700 followers do together in the flesh, as well as in the digital ether? What do you think, though? I mean, it's a good question, and I get a sense from the way you phrased it that you've been grappling with it yourself. Like, do you feel excited and animated by a new sense of digital communication and activism, or does it start to feel a little, or does it start to feel anemic to you, or too easy, or?
Well, I think there's definitely this kind of like conflict between the great potential of using social media or like using the internet to access a big portion of the population that are ready and willing to do something about these problems that we're facing, and then just simply not reaching them because like there's so much around you, or like people just don't care, you know, and they want to post whatever they want to post. But then there are also these accounts, like I immediately think of, like the obvious one is like Humans of New York, which may just seem like a very, you know, baseline way to just like, as it started, I think just to photograph people in the city, but then now it's kind of transformed into telling these stories that were kind of just getting lost. Like there's a whole series of like following Syrian refugees, or talking about you know, domestic violence that you faced as a kid. So I think that is a kind of a shining example of like where it could succeed as like a hyper-personal form of storytelling that also has the potential to reach, I don't know, people who care enough to listen or to do something about it.
Yeah, that last link you made I think is really powerful, is what makes any of us care. Like, and I mean this in a very literal sense, like when did you find yourselves checking out during the presentation for all the reasons you might? You're tired, or I'm repeating myself, or it just doesn't interest you, right? And then when did you snap back in because something drew your attention? And that's the question, right? Always in any context. And I think one of the things that's tricky with any of this, whether it's an exhibition or social media or organizing or this talk, is the allure of scale. So I had a conversation with somebody like, how many people are going to be there, right? And this notion that if the room were brimming, somehow the energy would be better or more, the dialogue would have been successful, or my ego would have been satiated or whatever, right? And I, in that moment of anxiety of like, I've come all the way across the ocean and for what, right? For what? I remembered this adage that whoever's in the room is who's supposed to be there and is where you do the work. And so sometimes the work might be at scale of mobilizing tons and tons of people. And other times it might only be those 130 people who hear that story of the refugee, but those are the 130 who will then in turn enact that in their worlds. And we can't always see what I call the half-life of an intervention, the ripple effect, right? And sometimes it's acting on faith, that if it's only with this group of people we have right now, that this is enough to make a shift, right? But, you know, you have your lives and your majors and your schoolwork or your jobs or your families, or, and so when we start then trying to scale it out, it gets that much more complicated. And so I neither want to fetishize the local nor the macro, like, giant. Like, they both have their utilities and they both have their limits. So to go back to what for me is the heart of your question, each endeavor might require a slightly different approach. I think the community that people make through social media can be really rich and powerful. And I get to stay in contact with my aunties and cousins all over the world and across languages because of social media in a way I couldn't a decade ago. And you know, that's an example.
I wanted to know how, like, you approach the texts that you use in your art, whether they're in Spanish or in English, and like how, or through the process, or even in an initial encounter with that text or with that person who first gave you that idea to use it.
It's a great question. Do you work with text? Are you a writer or a text-based artist, or you're just curious based on stuff you saw?
I'm from Peru. My mother tongue is Spanish, and I find myself, especially in NYU and when traveling, that like the way that I interact with people and the way that I consume language, either through text or speaking, it's very important. So I was just...
Yeah, absolutely. And just, this is not a good or a bad value judgment, but just how many of you, we're in Italy, so maybe I know the answer, but how many of you move in multiple languages? Yeah, and again, I'm not talking about super fluid and you could be like a UN translator. I just mean, do you feel like you work in some kind of a mix of languages, right? Can I try to address your question through two English pieces and then maybe work to the multilingual? Not that English isn't part of a multilingual. This piece, I'll get more honest now. I've been working with a medium that a former student of mine introduced me to. So she understands herself to be a channel to other dimensions. So you may, that already we may have lost half of you, or some of you may have been like, right. So, and she works out of many traditions, but primarily the Yoruba tradition, which came with, through the African diaspora, particularly folks from Nigeria, what we now know as Nigeria. And this is a message that came through her to me in a session we had in March. And the message was, the time of considering yourself to be only human is long gone. What am I supposed to do with that, right? Like, let's make art, you know? So like I've been sitting with that idea, like, do I trust this channel? My former student really recommended her, so there's something that I trust to follow. It's back to process. I didn't go looking for it, but in some ways it's touching on the edge of something that I've been curious about. And a text arises, right? And I didn't show you guys in the interest of time, but I've been working on this body of work that's on the that's on the flyer, right? Where this creature called the oscillator, I talked about the word search, that moves in and out of spaces that we call parks. We will now demarcate nature. This is nature, this is a park, which I love. I love parks. I'm trying to understand this separation we make between human and nature, right? And over time, this series started where it's more like a character in a suit. And as it's evolved, the character's becoming less and less a character or a person, maybe more and more a thing or just a presence. Is that making sense? So then I read this message that comes through as being in some ways about that, in some way. I'm going to leave that there without trying to put a neat bow on it yet. Also this summer, I'm working with another former student. I'm so grateful for these moments where my students are now my teachers and we have these exchanges, right? And he's part of an art collective. He grew up in North Philadelphia, a very working class African-American community. And there's a very famous theater there called the Uptown. And the Uptown, for any of you who know US context, is a bit like Harlem's Apollo Theater. So all kinds of really important performers, particularly black performers, but also of many backgrounds, come. If you come in through Philly, historically you're going to perform at the Uptown. James Brown, Patti LaBelle, all kinds of people. But the Uptown is in great disrepair now, and you might see from those two names I said that for a certain generation it was the spot in the heart of the black community, but is no longer open. So my student, Victor Peterson, who's an artist and part of a collective called the Free Breakfast Program, back to process, inspired by the Black Panthers notion that you got to feed folks if you want folks to be able to learn, right? That might seem like a prerequisite. They call themselves the Free Breakfast Program, and they had long wanted to activate this now, I'll call it sleepy site, that was no longer pulsing with this rich history that it had. So to get to this text, which we then installed on the marquee, so it doesn't quite look like it in this picture, but it's a marquee that's like this, so from one side you see one thing, and they were spinning all these things, and should we use Shaka Khan lyrics, or should we come up with something that one of their moms said, or where should the text come from? Your question, right? And they were thinking about the space as a kind of a love letter between the space and the neighborhood, right? And so they came up with this: where have you been? Which you might see if you're approaching from one side. I'm right here, my love. Trying to tell this love letter, kind of like some of the musical histories that have coursed through this theater, now boarded up but trying to come back to life. And as if maybe the space was talking to the neighborhood or the neighborhood to the space, or both, right? So those are two examples, very different kinds of processes, two different kinds of spaces. One is a gallery space, one is a public marquee. And when they were installing, like, it mobilized all these folks, busy urban street, coming through and saying, I have all these memories of this space and it's so good to see it coming back. Like, people who had been in that place for a while held that history, right? And the text itself, if you just read it literally, it may not seem that poetic or magnificent, right? But in the larger context, as lived by people there, it starts to take on. And so to get to Spanish in particular, for me, I'll activate it in all kinds of ways. And in this case, I probably wouldn't have asked them to do a Spanish text because it's not the primary language of the neighborhood. But we've talked about doing a series. And if this is the first of what might become 7, 8, 12, I might on number 9 mix it up a little bit, right? Or go try to work with some of the Chinese merchants and have some Mandarin, right? Or something, right? Like, what would it mean to let all the languages that are there? Because there are Puerto Ricans that work in the neighborhood, for instance. It's not that Spanish is absent, but it probably wouldn't have been the first gesture in a series. Does that make sense? And so sometimes I'm working with language that makes sense and arises from its space, and then other times we'll do it as a way to counterpoint it. And when I've been listening to the Italian, which I don't really understand, but I can kind of fake it because I speak Spanish, I've been trying to think about what would it mean to do a Spanish intervention here that sometimes looked like Italian, but it was Spanish, and then sometimes revealed the distance between the two languages and did this kind of yo-yoing. So even just being here makes me think of new kinds of spaces, pieces.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.